Welcome into the Fighting Saints Report. Jack Milewski and Jim Leitner. If you're listening, it's the evening of Monday the 17th, and the Fighting Saints are coming off a 3-game week. We're not recording on Monday night. This is a pre-recorded episode, but we're doing our power rankings. So if they look a little bit different than you might have ranked them, think that has something to do with the fact that 3 games or so have been played for some of these teams. But due to circumstances, we're pre-recording this, and it's a power ranking episode. We've done this before. It was also a pre-recorded version, and largely these won't change, I think, in our minds based on what happens this week. In the Western Conference, it might be the difference between 7 and 8 for some of these teams, 5 or 6, whatever it may be, because there's just so much ebb and flow to those standings. But for the most part, you're going to have your top teams that are solidified, your bottom teams that are solidified, and we'll do our best to not change the standings this upcoming week when this is actually being played out. But we'll start from 16, we'll move to 1, and we'll do half and half as we take a break in the middle. And for a lot of these towards the bottom of the standings, it might be a little bit of Jim has one different, I have one different, but I don't think 16 is going to be different. And unfortunately for the Madison Capitals, they were 16 last time. I can't imagine you had them anywhere other than 16 this time.
No, they've struggled so much all year. It's just kind of hard they really haven't made a run. I expected them to make a run at some point this year, but they really haven't. This is a team at the beginning of the year. Dubuque saw them twice real early in the year, a couple real close games. I thought this was a team that would be much improved, possibly be in a position where they could contend for a playoff spot. I think that's pretty much out of the question right now. I really like Carson Bantle, who leads them in scoring. He's a guy who's about a point per game, and in net, I thought just in seeing Simon Lecozzi at the beginning of the year, I thought he was going to be a big difference maker in the tradition that the Capitals have had the last few years, but it really hasn't materialized for Madison, and they're in a position right now where they're pretty far out of it, and potentially they could be a spoiler for some teams in the Eastern Conference moving forward down the stretch run, but even that I don't think has been. They had one good run, but that's been really about it.
Yeah, and for the Capitals, they traded away Christoph Papp, who was their second leading scorer outside of Bantle, really early in the season, and almost before you start selling. They were still mathematically in it. They still are right now, but when you trade away your second leading scorer, that almost suggests that you don't think you have a legitimate chance, and that's what they did. They traded him to Des Moines. So the Capitals are the clear 16 seed in these power rankings. Now I think it does get a little bit interesting for a while here, because the way some teams have played, the way some teams have trended, you could have had them as low as 13 or 12 in the last rankings, and they could be all the way up closer to 5 now. But who do you have at number 15?
I have the Youngstown Phantoms at number 15. I just their goal differential is really what's the difference for me. We saw them recently against Dubuque, and there were times in that series where I thought, geez, they're not that bad, or they're not as defensively, they're not as bad as I thought they were going to be. But then they'd go on a stretch where they'd give up 2 goals in a couple minutes, and that was the difference in the game. So I think that's really the big difference for me. They're just their goal differential is second worst in the league, and I think that's a big telling point. I love Trevor Kuntar. He's been a consistent goal scorer all year. Right behind Reese Gaber, and even though Dubuque shut him down. But again, there's a big drop-off between Kuntar as their leading scorer and Matt Cassidy as their second leading scorer, and they just don't have that depth. They're not the team that was as hard to play against as we've seen from Youngstown the last few years.
Yeah, I also have the Phantoms at 15, and largely for the reasons that you said. I think the 2 biggest ones are the lack of depth outside of Kuntar. Cassidy has 29 points. Kuntar has 43. It's a 13-point gap, which is the largest between any team's leading scorer and their second highest scorer in the USHL. And then the defense. When you're giving up over 160 goals already at this point in the season, it's not a recipe for success. I think their goal differential is getting dangerously close to minus 50. They haven't scored 120 goals yet, and they've given up at least 160. So the Youngstown Phantoms, they're really struggling, and especially in the playoffs. playoffs when defense becomes the bigger key, I think, in a lot of those games and those tight games. It's who's able to make some big stops when you need it. Youngstown just doesn't have that going for them right now, so the Phantoms, for me, are 15. Next up for the power rankings, number 14, I have the Sioux City Musketeers here. Sioux City, because of, again, we're pre-recording this, but the last weekend before we're talking about this, they went 2-3. And they, again, when I was looking at them and the Youngstown Phantoms, Youngstown, I believe, has a couple more points than Sioux City, but Sioux City's goal differential is only minus 11, I believe, or minus 9, something along those lines. And I think the Musketeers are just a little bit better of a team. Their offense is right around the same as Youngstown, and their defense is a lot better than the Phantoms. So I give the nod to Sioux City, the bottom team in the Western Conference right now. The Musketeers will get the 14 seed.
Yeah, I also went with Sioux City as my number 14 team, and the one thing that really stands out to me is they've had 43 different players play at least a game for the Musketeers, and we'll get into that statistic a little bit later in the show, but when you've had 43 different guys in your roster, you can have 23 active at a time, so they're almost double the amount of players that you can have on a roster. At 43 players used, they just really haven't had a consistency, haven't got into much of a flow, and they just really haven't been as consistent as you need to be to especially compete in the Western Conference, which is really tough.
Yeah, you really can't go on many weekends where you lose both games in the Western Conference or you lose some serious ground, and Sioux City's had a few too many of those weekends this year.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Jumping up to 13 for me, I'm going to go with the Cedar Rapids Rough Riders, which is kind of tough for me to say. I thought at the beginning of the year, I thought this team was going to be a much better team than they've shown. Injuries have been a big part of that. I really like Nikolai Mayarev, their leading scorer. He's just shade over a point per game. Grant Silanoff, I thought he was going to be a bigger point producer. Mm-hmm. He's probably the one guy last year that I thought deserved to be drafted out of the USHL but wasn't. Mm-hmm. And I was really hoping he'd go to Notre Dame this year so Dubuque wouldn't have to see him very often, but he came back and I don't know if he's been banged up this year or not, but he hasn't produced quite the way I thought he was going to, and he's still a dangerous player. I think he still could go on a run here at the end of the season and really uplift Cedar Rapids into the playoffs, but his production is really not quite where I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, Silanoff has been a kind of a disappointment this year in terms of production. As you mentioned, I thought he was snubbed from the NHL draft last year, so a guy that already plays with a chip on his shoulder, expected that to grow even larger, and whether it has or not, the points just haven't followed. Mayorov is the one bright spot. He wasn't even on the team to begin the year, but he's got an NHL shot. He's a pure sniper, and he's put together a pretty fantastic season so far for the Rough Riders, but again, this is a team that just doesn't have enough offensive firepower. They've had injuries up and down the lineup, and I have them at 13 as well. We've gone 4 for 4 so far on these power rankings. The bright side for them is how weak the bottom of the Eastern Conference is. They're going to be in striking distance, I think, for the rest of the season. It's just whether they're able to get healthy enough to make the run that they need to get into the playoffs, and then also if they're able to make any noise in the playoffs, because it's one thing to get in, it's another thing to have an impact in the playoffs, and I just don't know if many of the teams towards the bottom of the Eastern Conference are going to make an impact in the playoff once they get in. So Cedar Rapids at 13. Eastern Conference heavy here to begin the rankings because I've got Muskegon at 12, a team that I think is going to be really, really good next year because of how young they are and how many pieces they will have coming back likely on the team. They have been pretty active. They've made a couple moves. They traded away some veteran guys. Nash Nienhuis was one of them. Oliver McDonald was just traded as well. But they have almost a new core of young talent. Daniil Gushin's going to be really interesting because he's got plenty of years of eligibility left, but he's also got plenty of talent that would suggest that he might not be coming back for another year. Rhett Pitlick then is the guy that you would look at to kind of be the cornerstone on offense. He's really taken off since he hopped onto the Muskegon Lumberjacks, but when you lose all the scoring, all the talent they had that last year, it's so tough to come back and be even close to what they were. And I don't think this has been a bad season for Muskegon, but when you compare it to last year, it's not close, and the Lumberjacks are going to make the playoffs, but again, don't know if they're going to make any noise.
Yeah, we're 5 for 5. I have them at number 12 as well. And, again, they've used 46 different players this year, which is the second most, behind only Team USA, which is actually 2 teams. So 46 players. That's kind of a concerning number to me because, we go back a couple months and Muskegon was a team that was really young, and I thought the idea was that they were going to develop a lot of these players for next year and be, an Eastern Conference heavyweight next year. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I understand the logic of all the moves that they've made, but I would have thought that they would have stayed the course with what they had and really grown, because I thought they were a decent team, a decent but young team that had a chance to be really something special next year. Hopefully, in their case, they made these moves and they think they're even going to be better than what I thought they were going to be. So yeah, that's where I have Muskegon at number 12. Gushkin, again, I think he's a dynamic player. He's an elite level player, but I can see him moving on to maybe a major junior next year if he continues to produce the way he has, because I know there's going to be a lot of interest at the major junior level.
3 more teams here before we take our first break. Who's number 11 for you?
I got the Des Moines Buccaneers at number 11. That's a team that again, kind of a mystery team for me. I thought, when Dubuque saw them earlier in the year, back in November, I thought this was going to a team that would contend for the, one of the top seeds in the Western Conference. They just haven't had that consistency, and I don't know if teams have really figured them out or figured out their MO quite a bit, but they just haven't produced the way I kind of thought they were. And, it's funny because we talk about, we have them at number 11, but this is actually a good team. There's a lot of good teams at the bottom here, with the exception of maybe Madison. A lot of these are kind of interchangeable, and, any of these teams can go on a run and they can really jump in the power rankings.
Yeah, the Buccaneers were 6 for 6 now. I have them at 11 as well, and it's that inconsistency. They do a lot of things really well. They do a lot of things really bad. It's largely been pretty good on offense, pretty poor on defense for Des Moines. They've struggled. The net minding hasn't been great. I think the Cameron Rowe was a player that came from the NTDP and took another year in the USHL, and Des Moines drafted him 6th overall in the Phase 2 draft, and I think they had some higher expectations for him. He hasn't produced very well, and the defense has been a part of that. But, 2 weeks ago, you beat Chicago 7-6, and that was the final game of the weekend for Des Moines, a 3-3. And then you lose to Cedar Rapids this weekend 5-2. So that inconsistency, that kind of sums it up for me, those 2 games where you beat the best team in the league in terms of their record in Chicago, and then you lose to a team that isn't even in a playoff spot in back-to-back weekends. So the Des Moines Buccaneers' inconsistency is the reason I have them at number 11. If they can figure out the defensive side of things, I think they'll be a pretty strong force in the Western Conference, but I just don't know if they figure it out. So they are outside my top 10, and with 2 more teams, we'll dive into the top 10. I've got the Sioux Falls Stampede at number 10. They're 7-2-1 in their past 10. They're 1 point away from the playoffs with 2 games in hand. They've gone on a tremendous run, really, since the winter break ended, where they've just been putting together, it's always 6-4, 7-3 in their last 10, it seems, for the last couple months. And I got Sioux Falls at 10 because they are just on the outside looking in, but I love the way this team is trending, and if they continue this push, they're going to be well inside the top 10 of the power rankings and well inside a playoff spot.
Yeah, this is where our first deviation here. I'm going to go with the Lincoln Stars at number 10, just because I like Sioux Falls. I like the way Sioux Falls has been trending. This was one area where I could have flipped a coin on Lincoln and Sioux Falls for that number 10 spot, but I like Sioux Falls a little bit better for the 9 spot. Mm-hmm. So getting ahead of myself, but I like Lincoln is at number 10 for me, just because this is a team that I thought was going to be really good in the first half. I thought that was a team that would be a lot more consistent and challenge for that number 2 spot, but they really haven't. The thing that really impresses me about Lincoln is, we're going to talk about Chicago later in the program, but their top 3 scorers are all former Chicago Steel players. Travis Traylor, Kristen Sarlo, and Josh Grohl, all 3 are former Chicago Steel players, outstanding players. So can you imagine how much better Chicago would be? Chicago's been first place all year. If they had those 3 dynamic players, you're talking about another line, 4 lines, great scoring lines. So I'm going to go with Lincoln Stars at number 10.
And so you just teased it a little bit, but Sioux Falls then your number 9 team, and I'm guessing the difference is just the consistency over the past month or so?
Yeah, I think the real difference maker for Sioux Falls has been Jackson Stauber. He was a goaltender who started out at Minnesota State as a freshman this year, and wasn't playing a whole lot. I don't know if he even played a game from Minnesota State, and he decided to come back to the USHL, led the Stampede to the Clark Cup Championship last year, and now I see that he's committed to Providence for next year. But he's been really the difference maker for the Sioux Falls Stampede. He's gone 11-5-1 with a 2.67 goals against average and a 9/11 save percentage. I think that's been the difference. And you have a cup-winning goaltender coming back. I see them rising even more. And, when we talk about this maybe a month from now, I think Sioux Falls could crack that upper half of the USHL.
And I think last time we had these power rankings, they were 14 or 13 on both of our lists, and now they're in your top 10 and at 10 for me. My number 9 before we take our first break, Team USA. Really haven't liked how this team has been trending. 1-8-1 in their last 10 at the time of this recording, a 6-game losing streak. Team USA hasn't played a game in 2 weeks. Their U17s have been off, and the U18s have been at the Five Nations tournament. So I think the positive for them is that the U18s will be playing some more games coming up. Hopefully that gets them back on track. The U17s have really struggled after their hot start. They were tearing it up, but now I think teams have started to figure them out and been able to score at will on the younger group. So Team USA might climb a little bit, but right now, just because of almost this free fall trend where when 10 games ago they were 4 points up on the Fighting Saints in the standings, and now the standings, Dubuque has a 10-point advantage on them, still with, I believe now it's 1 game in hand for Team USA, but a big flip for those teams, and they're trending in the wrong direction. So they are just inside the top 10, but not going in the right direction. They're my number 9. So that's the first half of the rankings. We will take a break. When we come back, it's 8-1 as we see who lands number 1 and what we have between there and then. And then towards the end of this show, we're going to talk about the anniversary of the Miracle on Ice coming up next weekend. Welcome back to this Power Rankings edition of the Fighting Saints Report. Jack Milewski and Jim Leitner. If you tuned into the first segment, you already know this, but this is a pre-recorded version, so the overall stats that we're mentioning are reflective of what happened this past weekend. They haven't been updated for this most recent weekend for any of those teams, but still kind of a good reflection of where these teams have been over the last couple months since we did the previous power ranking. We're into the final 8, the second half of these power rankings, and we'll start with number 8. And I think based on what we've just talked about, our rankings start to deviate a little bit here. Who do you have at number 8?
Yeah, I have the Green Bay Gamblers at number 8. Green Bay is a team that again, it's been kind of a frustrating team. When you looked at their roster at the beginning of the year, you saw so many veteran players coming back. I thought this was a team that was going to be contending for, one of the top seeds in the Eastern Conference. They really haven't. And I don't know if it's a matter of they're pacing themselves or they're just saving the best for the end. When veteran leadership is always so important, but they just haven't. They really haven't clicked the way I thought they would. And I really like Jesse Tucker. He's their leading scorer, just almost not quite a point per game, but he's such a tough, hard-nosed player. And but again, I don't know if their veterans have really stepped up and led them the way I kind of expected them to.
Yeah, it doesn't seem with the veteran players. We've talked about all season long the jump that a Gaber has taken, the Jackson twins have taken from year 1 to year 2. A lot of their players don't seem to have taken that jump.
Yeah,
they seem to be roughly the same players that they were the year before, and I think that was the expectation with the veteran team, was that they were going to take a jump. They really haven't. Other than Tucker, the production's kind of stayed the same for a lot of those guys. For me, number 8, I have Lincoln, 5-4-1 in their last 10. The reason I have them at number 8, I could have dropped them a little bit lower. I don't necessarily think they deserve to be any higher, but a couple games that they've played recently have given me hope that they might be able to figure things out defensively. One of those games was against the Fighting Saints, and granted that was a team that was playing their final game of a 3-3, but it's also a Fighting Saints team that's put up 6 goals or more in 5 of the last 10 games. So they've been scoring at will against a lot of these teams, and Lincoln's a team where the defense has been the biggest question mark. The way they played in that game, they have enough speed where they don't even have to play a great structured defense. They can get after you so quickly on the forecheck that they create havoc before you even get out to center ice. That's how they beat the Fighting Saints in that game. I think that their top 3 scorers, as you mentioned at the first half of this show, all dynamic. They've got a lot of skill, much like Des Moines. If they can figure out the defensive side of things, I think they have a good chance to make a little bit of noise in the playoffs, but that's a big if because the last couple years, defense has really been struggle for Lincoln. So I have them at number 8, and I'll just hop right into number 7 because you just mentioned this team, the Green Bay Gamblers. Really like the way Green Bay's been trending with Team USA still ahead of them in the standings. I have Green Bay ahead of them in the power rankings because for the first time in a long time, it seems like someone might be able to crack the top 3 that's not Team USA, Chicago, or Dubuque. Gamblers are 6-3-1 in their past 10, 4 points back of third place, and this is almost like, I think this is the team that we saw with Dubuque last year, right, where veteran players, a lot of returners from college for Dubuque last year, we expected them, okay, this is the week they're going to start to get going. This is the week they're going to start to get going, and they never did. It's kind of how I feel about Green Bay this year. A lot of pieces where they should probably be doing better than they are in my mind, so we'll see if this is when they really start to get going, but the Gamblers could be higher by the end of the season. It just needs more consistency.
All right, I'm at number 7 now. I'm going to go with Team USA, which is a team that you had, I believe, at number 9. I think it's a team that kind of a bit of a mystery to me because at times the U17 team looked really dynamic. Mm-hmm. I believe they had a 10 or 11 game winning streak, and most of it was the U17s.
I want to say it was like a 7-4 split in favor of the U17s.
And the U17s were really dynamic. As you mentioned, the rest of the league has kind of caught up to the U17s and really figured them out. It's kind of a tricky thing because I do think the U18 teams play the bulk of the games here in the second half, so it's going to be a chance where they're going to rise. Mm-hmm. I think the U18 will help the overall composite team rise, but then you have, if they make the playoffs, the U17 team represents Team USA in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. So it's always a tricky, no matter what year it is, whatever. It's always a tricky to rank Team USA because it's those 2 different teams. But I have them at number 7. I just think it's a good hockey team, and the U18s are going to pull them up, and then we'll see what happens with the 17s.
Next up, number 6. Who just missed out on your top 5?
I'm going to go with the Tri-City Storm. That's a team that. And there have been times when they started out not very well because they were the best team in the USHL last season. A lot of turnover, and it took them a little while to find their game. They have. Anthony Noreen does an outstanding job of coaching that team up every single year. But again, they had so much turnover. They experienced a lot of growing pains in the first half, but in the second half, they've probably been one of the most consistent teams in the Western Conference. Mm-hmm. I really like Colby Ambrosio, about a point per game scorer for them, leading scorer for the Storm. And but again, I think it's just a matter of them finding their groove, and it's actually kind of the exact opposite of last year, where pretty much from start to finish they were the best team in the Western Conference, and this year it's been more of a growth experience for the Storm.
Yeah, the Tri-City Storm, also the team that I have just missing out on the top 5. They've had a nice turnaround. They were really struggling at the beginning of the season with their defense, like a lot of these teams on the list. but what they've been able to do is kind of buy into the system, it seems a little bit more, and they're playing a lot better defense as of late. Again, 6-3-1 in their last 10 at the time of this recording, so much like the Gamblers, starting to trend in the right direction. And you mentioned Colby Ambrosio. Another player that's been tremendous is Matthew Nyes, and he's the second leading rookie scorer in the league. It's a two-man race now for that title, I believe. Brendan Brisson for Chicago, 43 points, and Nyes with 37, and then you have to jump 7 points down to find Ryan Kerwin for Madison at number 3. But Nyes has been a tremendous addition to that team, a team that lost a lot of scoring, especially from their blue line. They've replaced it with more conventional methods up on the forward position, but just outside of my top 5, Tri-City. And it was very tight between Tri-City and the number 5 team, the Fargo Force, for me, because Fargo is trending in the wrong direction. They're 4-5-1 in their last 10. But one of the reasons that I put them at number 5 is they still have games in hand on everyone in the Western Conference. They've played the lightest schedule to date in the USHL, so they can make up those points without giving up any games in hand. I think Fargo's going to be in the top 4 of the Western Conference. I don't know if I'm, top 3 in the Western Conference. I don't know if I'm convinced that they're the number 2 seed anymore, but I think Fargo is definitely strong enough to be a top 3 team, and with the games in hand, they'll be able to make up a couple points.
Well, I think we're getting back on track here a little bit. I got Fargo also at number 5. Again, that's such a tough team to play against. I kind of expected that they'd have a better weekend against Waterloo a couple weekends ago. I kind of expected that they would split with them, even though it was in Waterloo, because they're such a tough team to play against. But that's a team that I'd like. I just like the makeup of that team going forward, and the fact that they added Oliver McDonald from Muskegon. Glad to see him out of Muskegon. If you're a Fighting Saints fan, it's he's a player who is about a point per game for the Lumberjacks and one of their more veteran players. But I think he's got the potential to be a real key add to the Fargo Force and could make them a dangerous team coming out of the West. I would not be surprised to see them take out Waterloo and represent the Western Conference in the Clark Cup final.
Fargo at 5, and the top 3 have remained the same in different order throughout the season, so I don't think that we're going to have a surprise here at number 4, but who's your number 4?
Well, I'm going to go with the Omaha Lancers. I just think they've been playing the most consistent hockey in the Western Conference, and they've risen quite a bit this last month or so. And again, that's a team they've utilized 43 different players this year, which is a very high number. And a lot of times you just don't see, when you use that number of players, it takes a while to develop chemistry. Fortunately for the Lancers, they've been able to do that. I think the biggest key pickup has been Nash Nienhaus from Muskegon on the back end. He's been a dynamic player, and he's been really good. They got Ross Mitten from Lincoln, Luke Mobley from Muskegon, got a couple other. Cole Kodzi from Madison was a nice pickup too, and you usually don't see a lot of teams make a lot of movement. When they make a lot of trades, you don't see them jump. But this is the one team I think that's made the biggest jump by going out and making acquisitions in season.
Yeah, last power rankings, I want to say I had Omaha 8 or 9, and based on their record, it could have been even a little bit lower. But this was a team that coming into the season, I thought they were going to be one of the top teams in the Western Conference, and right now holding on to the 2 seed in the West, but it's been so volatile, as we've touched on in past weeks, that they might not stay there for that long. But I think they're starting to finally play the brand of hockey that could keep them towards the top 3 rather than being peppered from anywhere from 3 to 6 in the standings. And I do think, having watched Omaha in person twice now, they play a really good brand of defensive hockey. It was a 3-2 victory for Dubuque in Omaha in a shootout, and it was a 2-1 victory here on home ice when they played Omaha. So I think the Omaha Lancers play the right style of hockey to succeed in the playoffs, and number 4 for me. Number 3, the final Western Conference team, and this is kind of details how deep the West is, because I believe from 3 to 10, I've had every single Western Conference team except for 2 of them, and you as well, but just not quite as good. Their top tier team is not quite as good, I think, as the rest of the USHL. Waterloo at 3. It's not really for a fault of their own. It's just that Dubuque and Chicago have been better this season, but the Waterloo Blackhawks maintaining a comfortable advantage in the Western Conference. For them, I think it's going to be, can they find a real number one scorer? Because Xander Lampa was that for a time, but I don't think he's built to be a guy that leads you scoring the entire season. Griffin Ness has been unreal the last 10 games, and he's now tight with Lampa for the scoring race, but I don't know if they have that one guy that really can step up and be the leading scorer. Last year they had a couple in Firstov and Matej Blumel.
Yeah.
So for the Waterloo Blackhawks, great defense, great goaltending, really solid offense. Not sure if they have the top level talent that makes them a elite team yet.
Yeah, I think obviously we're agreeing on our final three, and no doubt about it. Would you say that there's a pretty clear separation from the three to the four and the rest of the pack? Or?
I would think so, and I think it's been kind of that way all season long.
Yeah, I would agree too.
Again, it's just that the top three teams have been pretty dominant, and no one else has found consistency.
Yeah.
I think talent-wise, you could challenge some of those below them, but they haven't shown the consistent ability yet.
The interesting fact that I noticed in researching this, the top three teams have had the fewest number of players on their roster this year. Dubuque is number one with 27 players. Waterloo is number two at 28. And Chicago is number three at 31 players. So it's really kind of interesting that they've stayed healthy, and their general managers and coaches did a really good job of picking the right guys at the beginning of the season. They haven't felt the need to go out and make a lot of changes. And looking at all three of these rosters, I don't know that they're going to.
Why would you?
I wouldn't either. I mean, unless there's a piece out there that you feel like you're missing. I don't know that any of these teams do feel like they're missing a piece. But I too have Waterloo at number three. I like their top end talent. I like is really good. Lampa, Griffin Ness, Wyatt Shingothi, Ryan Drakulik, and Ryder Rolson all have 30 points or more. So they have a good dynamic offense. I don't think they're quite at the level that they've been the last couple years. Again, I don't think they're quite as deep. They're not as dynamic. But again, I think they're going to run away with the West. And I think they're a team that certainly could represent the West in the Clark Cup Finals if they can get past Fargo.
Yeah, it'll be shocking to not hear Waterloo's discussion late into the playoff race this year, the way they've been performing and the way they've consistently been performing. So here's the big question, 1 and 2. We know it comes down to Chicago and Dubuque, and these two teams, last time we did the power rankings, were also number 1 and 2 in the rankings. Number 2 or number 1, is Chicago been unseeded for you, or are they still the number 1 team in the league?
Chicago is still the number 1 team for me, and the reason why I say that is just the head-to-head. I think you could really flip a coin between these two teams. Dubuque, I think, has been trending really well, especially after that rough start coming out of the chute after Christmas. But when you have to flip a coin, I guess the difference maker for me is that 2-game series, that home-and-home series where Chicago found a way to win both of those games. I look at it and I think Dubuque had a really good chance to win both of those games, but Chicago is the team that found a way to win them. And, you have, 5 guys with 40 points or more in Chicago, and Brendan Brisson, who's, I think, is going to be the Rookie of the Year in the USHL. You have 5 guys who are averaging at least a point per game on that team, and good goaltending, solid defense. I just think they're a little bit. I'd love to see a 7-game series between Dubuque and Chicago. I think that would be an outstanding 7-game series. But as of right now, you have to go with the results of what they did head to head.
And that's when you look at all 3 of these teams, and we'll bring Waterloo back in the discussion. I also have Chicago 1, Dubuque 2, Waterloo 3. Waterloo has a couple more points than the Fighting Saints. A big separation between those two teams is, even though it's only a 1 win in the series, I think Dubuque has looked far more impressive against Waterloo in the head-to-head. They're 3-2 on the season series overall, but that's a main reason why I have Dubuque above Waterloo, is because they've looked more dominant in the head-to-head. Again, like you have Chicago, splitting hairs with these two teams, Chicago and Dubuque. Chicago has a very sizable lead in the standings. I don't think Dubuque is going to catch them simply because Chicago's too good to go on a big slide, especially when they're playing a lot of the teams in the bottom of the Eastern Conference. I think it's for Dubuque. It's not that you're resigned to the 2 seed, but you can't be disappointed if you continue to play really good hockey and don't get that 1 seed because Chicago's just too good to go on a slide.
Yeah.
And that's what it's going to take now. It's not only going to take Dubuque playing well, it's going to take Chicago playing poorly. If you look at the weekend when Chicago had the 3-3, they win all 3 games. Dubuque beats up on Youngstown twice and loses 2 points in the standings to the Steel. I mean, that's what it's going to be like when you're facing an elite team above you in the standings. So I love how Dubuque's been playing. I think defensively, there's no question in my mind they are the best defensive team in the league. I think there's no question that they have the best goaltending in the league with Eric Portillo between the pipes. And the way they've been scoring, they're proving that they're just about as deep as Chicago. The one thing that Chicago's done is they've had that dynamic scoring all season long. It's just started to come around for Dubuque. So Chicago's 1, Dubuque's 2 until proven otherwise, in my opinion. But it's not that the gap is very sizable. I think the gap's a lot smaller than the point gap in the standings.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And again, Dubuque, has 4 players with point per game production right now: Ty Jackson, Dylan Jackson, Reese Gaber, Mark Chirametta. And then Copperwood and Matthew Copperwood and Stephen Halliday are right close to a point per game, just shade under a point per game. And the way they've been trending, I think by the end of the season, I think they're going to be up over a point per game. So I like the depth that Dubuque has had, and I don't think it's bad that they had that 2-game sweep against Chicago earlier last month. I think that's actually made them better. I think it's given them a little bit more resolve, and I think they were sailing along for so long, and then they had that sweep by Chicago, which was a marquee matchup, and I think that's going to end up benefiting them in the long run.
Yeah, so the Fighting Saints and Chicago Steel again, 1-2 in the power rankings in that exact same order, and I think that shows, like we've talked about, the consistency of these teams. They've been so good that there hasn't really been any reason to put one past the other. Both have been trending in the right direction, and same with Waterloo and that number 3 seed. It's very strong 1, 2, 3, and then a pretty strong 4 through 10, I would say, before the bottom half starts to drop out a little bit in these USHL power rankings. So the power rankings are over. We will take a break, and when we come back, we reset with a little bit of Miracle on Ice because we're less than a week away from the anniversary of one of the greatest feats in hockey history. Welcome back to the Fighting Saints Report. Jack Milewski and Jim Leitner. And before we step away from this Power Rankings edition, we look at the Miracle on Ice, and the 40th anniversary of Miracle on Ice is coming up on February 22nd, so it will be the first night of a 3-3 for the Dubuque Fighting Saints. I believe they are in Plymouth, Michigan that night against Team USA. But Miracle on Ice, 1980 Olympics, and if you don't know the story, I don't know why, but if you don't know the story and you're listening to a hockey podcast, there might be an issue. But 1980, the Team USA team, essentially made of a bunch of ragtag players comparatively to what we see now from Team USA in the Olympics. But a bunch of players that are coming back from college, a really young team, a really inexperienced team, going up against a Soviet juggernaut that basically had the best players in the world at the time. They weren't allowed, the rule back then was NHL players weren't allowed to compete in the Olympics. We saw that recently with the new, the latest Olympics, and the NHL players aren't going to be able to compete. But basically what you had was the equivalent of like a high school hockey team going up against the USHL All-Stars.
Yeah, and
probably more of a discrepancy even than that.
Yeah, and the Russians were, technically they weren't professional players, but they were all like officers in the Russian army. Mm-hmm. So, and their job was to play hockey, I think 11 months out of the year. They trained, and they were the best team in the world. Yeah. Even they'd beat some NHL teams. They'd beat NHL All-Star teams.
Yeah.
So the problem was at that time they just couldn't get out of Russia. They were stuck playing in Russia. They had the best Russian players all playing together. Revolutionized the sport because they played as a 5-man unit, and they just attacked you as a 5-man unit. And it was, right before that Olympics, they were coming over to the United States playing exhibition games against NHL All-Star teams, NHL teams, and beating them.
Yeah.
So they were the best team in the world. And so for really a bunch of college kids, not many of those guys really turned out to be NHL superstars. It's not like you had guys who were NHL superstars in waiting. They really didn't turn out to be great superstars. So it really was an upset, but it was just a matter of, putting together the right system to beat a team like that and getting a great goaltending performance from Jim Craig and all the stars really aligning to create that miracle on ice, which is arguably one of the greatest moments in hockey history in North America.
Yeah, it's one of the greatest moments of hockey history, one of the greatest upsets of all time. It might be the greatest team upset in the history of sport. There's a lot of team versus individual upsets that have happened, but I can't think of another upset that really is more dramatic or more unexpected, all things considered. And really interesting. I mean, if you don't know a lot about the story, you've probably heard the famous call from Al Michaels, "Do you believe in miracles?" Yes, as the clock ticks down from 5 seconds to none. Lake Placid, New York, the site of that miracle on ice in 1980. But what a lot of people don't realize is, and I even sometimes forget, is that wasn't even the gold medal game.
No, it wasn't.
That was the semifinals. You had to go out and you had to win another game to win the gold medal, and I don't think if they had lost the gold medal match, Team USA ended up winning the entire Olympics. They beat Finland, I believe, in the gold medal match. Yes. But I think even if they lost it, people wouldn't really care, because that felt like, I think that's why you forget that it wasn't the gold medal match, because that felt like the biggest win in the Olympic history.
It was weird because it wasn't really actually the semifinals, just the way it was structured. Mm-hmm. I think if they would have lost against Finland, they wouldn't have got a medal at all. The way I understood it, and I remember back as a kid watching the Miracle on Ice, and at that, what's crazy about that is it wasn't on live television. It was the game was played at like 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they broadcasted it in prime time. So I remember as a kid watching that, and you're watching the game, and you're like, this is a great game, and then the local news came on, and as a commercial for their 10 o'clock newscast, they said, be sure to tune in at 10 for highlights of Team USA's stunning upset of Russia. So, I mean, at that time, the NBA Finals weren't even on live TV. So it was, kind of weird to, today it's crazy to think that, and it wasn't like the Olympics were over in Russia and it was tape delayed and you had to tape delay it because they were playing at 3 a.m. This was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was broadcast in prime time. So just a totally different time and a totally different era.
Yeah, it's there's a movie about obviously the Miracle on Ice called Miracle. I think if you don't want to. If you want to get the dramatized version, it's fantastic. It does give you the actual story, what happened. Obviously, it's made for Hollywood, so some of that stuff is different. But a couple things that I just always stand out to me about that. It was the first thing is a couple months previous to the Lake Placid game, Team USA actually played the exact same Russian team that was going to be in the Olympics at Madison Square Garden on a national stage, and they got thrashed 10-3. Yeah. And it wasn't even, they scored a couple of their goals late because the Russians kind of had won it at that point. I mean, they got absolutely embarrassed. So to be able to bounce back and somehow win on an even bigger stage is impressive. And the other thing to me is diving into the analytical portion of it or more of the coaching side of things is a big what if. What if Vladislav Tretiak had never been pulled after the first period? He let in a couple goals, but he was widely considered the best goalie in the world at that time. I mean, it was like how the NHL reveres Patrick Waugh or Marty Brodeur is by far the best goalies of that time. He was by far the best goalie in the world, and the Russian head coach pulled him. And I think that is, whether you don't take anything away from the Americans, but that's a big reason why that game might have been won, is because you make a rash coaching decision.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It's you talk about coaches, and I think Herb Brooks, gets a lot of credit, and he deserves a lot of credit for the mental approach he took to that. Part of me thinks that he didn't mind getting beat by the Russians in that game in Madison Square Garden, because maybe it motivated his group, and it gave the Russians maybe a false sense of security. The other coaching decision that you mentioned, pulling the goaltender, the Russians did not pull their goalie in the final minutes of that game because they never had to.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, in previous games, they never had experience. They probably never even practiced how to pull your goalie or how to, get that favorable matchup in the final minutes of the game. And, I remember, seeing highlights and, the Americans, like, what are they doing? They're not pulling their goalie. Yep. I mean, and I don't know if they just thought they were so confident that they were going to tie the game up or what, but they did not pull the goaltender in a one-goal game late.
It's something it is something that I think, take for granted because it's a big part of the game. If you're down by one, you pull the goalie, you get the extra attacker on. But like you said, when you haven't practiced it, you might not even be looking to the bench for that communication at that time, regardless of if you're down or not.
Yeah, it's crazy, and and that win. It's fun to look at the impact that win had on American hockey afterwards because, at that time it was just hockey was really kind of more of a niche sport. It really didn't take off. It wasn't what we know today, and I think that's one of the greatest moments to really developing this sport in the United States.
Yeah, 40 years to the day. It will be on February 22nd. Again, of maybe the greatest United States hockey moment in the history of the sport, and just overall one of the greatest moments in sport, and one of those calls that we'll watch 50 years from now and still, if you were alive at the time, remember kind of exactly where you were and how you first heard the news, and anyone that has then experienced it secondhand is going to remember the images and that call. So a tremendous sporting accomplishment there, and that's what we'll leave you with for the final thoughts of this Fighting Saints report. Speaking of the miracle on ice, the Fighting Saints, what that date represents also is the start of their 3-3 this weekend, another 3-3. They've got a couple more the rest of the way. Team USA on Thursday, and then Muskegon on Friday and Saturday. One of those weekends where you really hope you can get 4 of 6, and 3-3s are always tough to sweep, but if you can get those extra 2 points, it would be even better. So join us on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday on the road. Super Hits 106, your home for the Fighting Saints hockey. All the puck drops for this will be 6:05 Central puck drops because they are in the Eastern time zone. So a little bit earlier starts to every single night for the Fighting Saints in the Central time zone, at least if the broadcast is concerned. Thanks again for tuning in to the Fighting Saints Report, our Power Rankings edition, and we'll talk to you after the 3-3.